Hi everyone, this is Matthew Janda for Card Runners, and I'm here with Flopzilla Part 2, Visualizing Your Turn Range. So this video is the follow-up video to the Classroom Flopzilla video. In the previous video, we focused on using Flopzilla to balance our range on the flop when facing bets in position. This is probably the easiest post-flop spot in poker to balance your range, but as we saw, it is still quite difficult to do. So, if you've never balanced any sort of hands before in poker, the easiest thing to do is probably balance like a 3-betting range pre-flop. That's very, very simple to do. I have other videos on that, but this is probably the easiest post-flop spot to balance in poker, and because of that, it requires a lot more effort than just, 3-betting pre-flop and stuff like that. What were our goals on the flop? So whenever we think about theory, we always need to think about what are we actually trying to do here? What is the theory helping us do? Well, we want to defend enough so our opponent cannot profitably bet any 2 cards on the flop. That should make a lot of sense. When your opponent's out of position, he's pretty much guaranteed an opportunity to bluff on the flop. You don't want to be folding so much that he can bet his very, very worst bluffs on the flop. That doesn't make a lot of sense. We want to make sure we have the right ratio of value raises to bluff raises on the flop so we get to the river with a balanced range which makes our opponent indifferent to calling with a large group of hands, his bluff catchers. So, when we raise our opponent on the flop, and we bet the turn, and we bet the river, the vast majority of the hands our opponent gets to the river with are going to be bluff catchers. That's how it mathematically should work out. The whole reason why we're raising the flop is we're saying we have hands in our range that are either behind most of your value hands or ahead of most of your value hands, so the bulk of his range when he calls down to the river are going to be hands that are going to act as bluff catchers. We either beat them when we have a value hand or we lose to them when we're bluffing. And we want to make those bluff catchers indifferent to calling on the river since he'll have so many of them. If he always calls, that causes problems. If he always folds, that causes problems. Then we want to also put the right types of hands in our value raising range, calling range, and bluff raising range so we don't end up value raising ourselves often or calling with hands with the wrong type of equity. Sometimes we are going to value raise ourselves. Obviously, we can have bottom set on the flop and run into middle set. That's something we can't avoid. But for the most part, as I said, when we do raise the flop, we're going to be beating the majority of the hands that he may call down with. So we want to make sure we're putting the right hands in the right range, that we aren't value raising and making ourselves pay more than we needed to because our opponent has too many hands that beat us. So we need to put the right hands in the right range, and that's a very, very, that's the end goal. We're trying to just put the hands in the right range. This video will focus on turn play. This video will focus on applying the thought process we already learned to turn play. This video will be easier than the previous one to understand if you already watched and understood the first video. Poker concepts very often repeat themselves, and this is especially true here. I highly recommend you watch the first video before you watch this one. So as I mentioned briefly just a minute ago, the easiest spot to balance is 3-betting preflop. Concepts in poker very, very often repeat themselves. If you understand how to balance a 3-betting range preflop, then once you kind of get the grasp of that, the next thing you're going to want to do is, now that I'm not just randomly 3-betting hands preflop, I want to learn how to balance raising ranges postflop. It gets a little bit more difficult each time, but now that you're more comfortable with the concept, sometimes it's going to get easier. So even though the turn's a more difficult street, if you're learning how to balance your play on the flop for the very first time, that's probably going to be a lot harder than once you understand how to balance your flop play moving on to the turn. So what we're doing here is we're pretty much repeating the exact same concepts. The math and the ratio is going to change a bit, but we're using the concepts we used on the flop and we're applying them to play much more effectively on the turn. We will still repeat the process in the first video, which gets us to the turn with a balanced range. I will go over it quickly with much less explanation than in the first video, similar to how I would have to quickly make decisions while playing hundreds of hands an hour online and would not be able to make a perfect range. The bulk of our time will be spent on turn analysis. By analyzing how our range looks on the turn, we'll also be able to look back at the flop and see if we think we did a good job. Okay, so obviously I'm the first one to admit there's tons of players that are better than me. So even though I understand pretty well how to balance my turn range, I'm still a pretty good player. I'm far from perfect. I'm going to try to quickly balance my range on the flop, and I'll probably do a pretty decent job unless we get a really, really hard board texture, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to get the flop perfect. I'm going to do as good of a job as I reasonably can, so we can then move on to balancing the turn, and then after we try to balance the turn, which I'll put a little bit more focus on, try to be a little bit more careful, then we can look back and see, hey, you know what, maybe we could have improved our flop range by doing this. or by looking at the turn, we're better able to see if we made a mistake on the flop, or even if we spent a long time balancing the flop play, before we move on and try a bunch of different turn cards, we might not know if we're making a mistake. So the bulk of this lesson is really just going to be focused on turn play. The turn is very complicated. Almost all of our emphasis will be focusing on how our range should look so we cannot be exploited. I understand this does not do a great job of showing how our opponent's ranges should look to best paint the whole picture. We are limited to only 1 hour of content. How our opponent's checking range and betting range look, especially when our opponent can check raise the given turn board texture, is extremely relevant. We do not have time to discuss our opponent's range in detail. I may eventually make future Flopzilla videos which show how to play when you are out of position and deciding whether to bet or check. I need to release the relevant theory content for this before I can consider making those videos. Since playing out of position is much more difficult than facing a bet in position, it is necessary these videos come first. So usually, whenever you're trying to explain a concept to someone, it helps a lot if people understand all the related concepts really well. So for example, if I'm trying to explain one aspect of like microeconomic theory to someone, if they already have a good understanding of how microeconomics works, it's going to be a lot easier to explain that concept. I can use a lot of important terms and I can relate it to a lot of, other important areas. Here, I haven't released, a balancing your range out of position on the turn series or video or anything like that. So it's kind of unfortunate that we're having to talk about how to defend against a bet when we haven't really analyzed in detail how that bet looks. What exactly does it represent? What exactly does it mean? If you play a lot of poker, you probably have a pretty good idea, but we haven't really gotten into the theory of it. Likewise, if I were to explain whether or not you should bet or check out of position on the turn, it would help if we had a really good understanding of how does our opponent respond to a bet? How does our opponent respond to a check when he's in position? So we have to kind of pick one video or series to make first, and the bottom line is it's just much easier to defend against bets in position than decide whether or not to bet or check out of position. So we are going to make this video first, even though I know it's kind of a pain that we don't know exactly what the betting range looks like. We're almost in a way, it might even feel like we're ignoring our opponent's betting range a little bit. But, just keep in mind, what does a betting range usually mean? It means our opponent's representing a relatively polarized range where he's value betting some hands and trying to get value from our marginal strength hands, and then he's bluffing some hands which have some chance to improve usually that he's trying to make better hands fold. So that's all that's happening here. Betting ranges are a little bit more complicated, but for the most part, it's a polarized range with some good hands and some bad hands. He wants a call with some of his range and he wants a fold with some of his range, and we're trying to play effectively against that. Time to get started with some math.
Woohoo! Hey!
For some reason, I put an exclamation mark there. If you can get excited about math, go ahead and do it. As we discussed in the first video, we will need to defend around 60% of the time when our opponent bets 0.75 pot size bets to prevent him from being able to make a profitable bluff with any two cards. Very, very basic pot odds type math there. If you don't understand it, post about it in the forums or do a quick Google search. It's very, very important you understand where that came from and why a 0.75 pot size bet needs to work around 60% of the time. If we defend much more than this, we take away his incentive to bluff anything other than the perfect hands since he gets too few of folds. So if we're defending 80% of the time to a flop continuation bet, our opponent's only going to bet hands for value because we're calling so incredibly much. We're calling or raising 80% of the time. He doesn't have an incentive to bluff. When he does bluff, it's only going to be the really obvious perfect bluff hands, like when he has, an open-ended straight draw or a straight or overcards plus a gut shot. Some really amazing bluffs might still be able to bluff when we call too much, but most hands won't be able to profitably bluff. Likewise, if we defend less than this 60% of the time, he starts bluffing with his most awful hands, which have no business doing anything other than check folding. Like 8-7 suited on a king of clubs, 6 of spades, 2 of hearts, 2 of diamond board. If your opponent folds 60% of the time, he's only calling or raising 40% of the time, that you can get away with betting this awful hand on the turn in this board right here, which you probably shouldn't be able to bet with. You probably shouldn't be able to bet with 8 high as a bluff. That's probably a hand that you need to check fold. But if your opponent folds too much, you can go ahead and do that. You can exploit him by betting. So now we need to go over the turn raising math. When our opponent bets 15 big blinds into 20 big blinds on the turn for a 0.75 pot size bet, we'll often want to raise to around 40 big blinds. The pot is 50 big blinds after we call. Once again, there's the 20 big blinds already in the pot. the 15 big blinds that our opponent bet, and then our 15 big blinds that we would put in the pot if we called. So the pot would be 50 big blinds if we called, and we want the pot to grow at around an equal rate on the turn and river. I made a bet sizing series on card runners, which will explain all this stuff in much more detail. We're not going to go into detail here, of course, since this is a balancing the turn video. But just know all these formulas, all this math already is explained in other series. So if you are confused here or curious, be sure to check out the other series. So we use the bet sizing formula for a perfectly polarized range. The pot's 50 big blinds. The pot has 2 streets left, so it needs to grow at a rate of r squared for 2 streets. The final pot will need to be around 200 big blinds, since we're assuming 2 players with 100 big blind stacks, so r is going to equal 2. That means the pot needs to double on each street, and the way we of course accomplish the pot doubling on each street is to bet 50% on each street, since that way our 50% plus our opponent's 50% equals 100%, and the pot doubled. So betting 50% on each street accomplishes this, so by raising in a 50 big blind pot, we put in 25 big blinds more. The 15 big blinds that we would put in by calling, plus the 25 big blinds that we put in by raising, equals 40 big blinds total, so we raise to 40 big blinds. I'm not saying we should always use this sizing. I know you're not going to have a range that's always pure nuts or pure air. I'm simply saying this is, using math that we've already talked about in other series. This is a very reasonable size to make in a lot of on a lot of turn textures. And to be honest, this in practice is a very, very common turn raise sizing that I do use. Maybe I go a little bit less sometimes. If we raise to 40 big blinds on the turn, we risk 40 big blinds to win 35 big blinds. Our opponent will need to defend at least 47% of the time. If he's not defending 40% of the time, we're pretty much going to print money by bluffing with any 2 cards, and obviously we should have a folding range. We shouldn't be able to make a plus EV bluff with any 2 cards, so our opponent can't fold more than this. If we bet the river for 50 big blinds, our opponent needs to call around 67% of the time. We're only putting 50 big blinds into a 100 big blind pot, so our opponent's required to call a very large fraction of the time. Our opponent felts total around 47% times 67%, which equals 32% of his turn betting range to our flop raises. That's a pretty strong range, because he's not double barreling, a super wide range most of the time. People don't usually have turn betting ranges. Most people don't bet the turn over 55%. So when we do raise the turn, our opponent's going to have a pretty strong range when he's just double barreling the turn, and he only needs to felt, just around a third of it. So this is going to be a strong range. Our opponent risks 25 big blinds to win 75 big blinds on the turn, and 50 big blinds to win 100 big blinds on the river. Since we give him 3-to-1 odds twice, we thus need to bet the river 75% of the time for value, 75% of the time. So 56.25% of our turn raises must be able to value bet the river. So make sure for a second you understand all that math, because there's a lot of numbers and ratios in that. When we raise the turn, we're giving our opponent 3-to-1 odds. He's only risking 25 big blinds to win 75 big blinds. When we bet the river, the exact same thing happens. We're betting 50 big blinds into a 100 big blind pot, so our opponent risks 50 big blinds to win 150 big blinds. He's getting laid very, very good odds both times. So because of that, since we raise the turn, we need to follow through with a balanced range on the river, a very high frequency of the time. So when we raise the turn, we follow through 75% of the time, because once we bet the river with a balanced range, our opponent's indifferent to whether or not he calls with a bluff catcher. So by betting the river 75% of the time, for value 75% of the time, we make our opponent indifferent to whether or not he calls the turn. So that's our goal here when we raise the turn. We want to make our opponent indifferent to calling with a bluff catcher, because the majority of his range will be a bluff catcher, and by betting the river 75% of the time, for value 75% of the time, we accomplish this. So what does that mean? It means we need to be raising the turn and able to bet the river for value 56.25% of the time. So over half the time when we raise the turn, we know we need to be able to value bet the river. So now I want to do a quick summary before we generate flops. We now have covered very critical math to help us defend against bets. Let's do a quick recap. We usually want to defend against 60% of flop and turn bets when our opponent bets 0.75, pot size bets, and heads up pots. This is not exact and will change based on board texture. Make sure you understand when these frequencies would change. If he bets smaller, you need to defend more. He's getting a better price on his bluff. If you defend mostly by calling, you need to call slightly more because you're letting your opponent see a free turn or river card after he's bet. You're just simply calling rather than raising, so he gets to see that additional card. There's key flop frequencies that you need to know. That's 1.5 to 2 bluff raises for every 1 value made hand raised, and 0.5 bluffs for every 1 strong draw value raised. That's something very important we talked about in the last video. If you value raise a hand like a set, you're allowed a lot of bluffs. If you're value raising something like the nut flush draw, that's fine, but since the nut flush draw won't let you bet the river for value nearly as often as a set, you need to be bluffing less. There's the key turn frequencies, just under 1 bluff raise for every 1 value hand raised, and we are very unlikely to be raising a strong draw on the turn. We didn't go into the math because it's not really necessary, but just keep in mind when we did talk about how often we need to be able to follow through, if you were using a lot of really good bluffs on the turn, it would let you, get a much closer to this 1-to-1 bluff raise to value raise ratio on the turn, since your bluffs are going to improve more often. If you're using awful bluffs, you're going to have even a little bit more value hands than we talked about in the last slide, because your bluffs are very unlikely to improve, whereas your value hands might weaken to hands that can't bet the river. Nevertheless, we don't need to go into all that math detail, because the bottom line is, even if we did it all, we're going to find when we raise the turn, we usually need to have value around 55% of the time. So that's just under a 1-to-1 ratio, so that's the key thing you're going to need to remember here. Time to randomly generate some flops and turns. We'll continue with using a button flatting range against a middle position open, since it's in between the strength of most other flatting ranges. Once again, we're just trying to learn the methodology for doing this, so I'm just trying to pick a range that I think works overall pretty well. You'll obviously need to use this exact same process for other ranges as well, as you're trying to improve as a player. I just chose what I thought was a reasonable and commonly used range in this spot. I prefer to flat ace, king, and queens more than most, but just left ace, king off in for this video. So, when a middle position player opens in 6 max, I know most people prefer to almost always 3-bet ace, king, and queens. I flat with them more than most. I'm not saying which one's correct. There's no point in really getting into the details of pre-flop, but just know for this video I did not flat with queens, because I don't think most people do, but I did leave an ace, king off, but I put ace, king suited as a 3-bet. So, with that in mind, we're ready to get started. So here's the flatting range I'm going to use. As I said, we have ace, king off, but we don't have queens. Just look around for a second. I don't flat with pocket 3s or pocket 2s. It's not a problem if you do. I don't prefer to flat with the ace, jack off, or king, queen off, and I prefer to flat with a reasonable amount of suited connectors, but not as many suited gappers. It's fine if you disagree with these ranges. There aren't really any set-in-stone pre-flop flatting ranges, but nevertheless, these are the ones we're going to be using for this video. So let's randomly generate a flop and get started. We're first going to solve the flop quickly. Okay, so on the flop, how many combos do we have total? We have 109 combos total. We get a queen at 9, 2 of clubs flop. So the first thing that strikes me about this flop is ace queen is going to be very close for whether or not we want to raise with it or flat with it. People that think it's a slam dunk raise are probably off. It's not as close to a raise as they think it is. People that think it's like a slam dunk call, once again, it's close to a raise. It's right in between. So I'm going to raise with the only sets we can have are pocket 9s, so I want to raise a little bit more than that, so I'm going to raise with ace queen. I'm going to raise with half the combos, so I'm going to put down 6 there, then I'm going to raise with the pocket 9s. That gets us to 3 combos. Then I'm going to look at the flush draws really quickly. So we have the open-ended straight flush draw, and then 2 nut flush draws. So yeah, that looks good. I'll raise with those, and then 3 flush draws. So flush draws 3. So my total raising range is going to be around 12 combos. Then I'm going to call with, I'm just going to write this down, the flop at the top, queen of diamonds, 9 of diamonds, 2 of clubs. It's probably a good idea to save this stuff if you're really working hard on your game, so you can review how you used to play flops and slowly get better and use it as sort of like, it's really good to just print out flops you worked on to just take with you into a car ride and try to memorize them. Why not? Okay, so then we got those. So now let's see. We're going to want to bluff raise around how many hands? Bluff raise. Well, ace queen is 9s. Those are 9 made hands and 3 flush draws. So 9 times, like between 1.5 and 2. That's going to get us to be around what, like 15 to like 16 to 17 or 18. So let's just say 16 for those. Then the flush draws will add another 1 or 2. So let's say we're going to bluff raise 18 combos total. All right. So we had how many combos? We had 109 combos total. 109 times 60 equals 60% equals, probably should have done this to begin with, but doesn't matter the order. 109 times 0.6 equals, 66 combos. So we want to defend 66. We're raising 12 for value. We're bluff raising 18. So let's try to call with around 36. All right, so we've got the ace queen. We've got 6 of those combos left. Then we have, let's see what else we got. Top pair. All right, we've got 6 more. So let's do king queen suited, queen jack suited. So that means 6 more for those. Then we got pocket jacks, pocket tens. Those will all look like fine calls. That gets us to 12. What about the flush draws? Flush draws, we still have 4 remaining, so 4 flush draws. Let's see, opening and straight draws. Opening straight draws. We just want the straight draws, so that's going to be 3 jack 10 suited that aren't. Remember, we're not counting the flush draw again because we put that in the value raise. So that gets us to 12, 24, 28, 31. We need to get 5 more. Right, we're trying to get 36 or so. So yeah, let's just do 5 more. Alright, so we can just throw in some random stuff like, sure, let's go 10-9 suited and 9-8 suited. That gets us to, around 37. So we wanted 36, we got 37 unless I miscounted. I'm going to double check real quick. Because remember, we're trying to move on to the turn. 12, 24, 28, 31, 37. Okay, we've got 37 there. Then we're going to want to bluff raise 18. Let's throw in a bunch of gut shots. Gut shots. We got pretty much just king jack, alright? So we're not going to get a bunch of them. So we got king jack, which is going to be 3. Let's see what else we can raise with. Alright, so since we don't have any gut shots, let's do ace of diamonds, king x. That's going to give us 3. Let's do ace of clubs, king of clubs. That's going to give us 1. Let's do ace of diamonds, jack x. That's going to give us 3. Let's do ace of clubs, jack of clubs, ace of clubs, 10 of clubs. That gets us 2. Then let's see, what else do we got here? Just trying to find reasonable hands to raise with really quick. Once again, I'm trying to do this quick. It's not going to be perfect. Alright, how many are we at? We're at 3, 10. We're at 12. We need to get 12 more. Are there any more suited aces we can use? No. No. Okay, so we're kind of already... Okay, so here, we'll just do this. Ace X, king of clubs. Or sorry, ace X, king of diamonds. That gets us 3 more. And then ace... And then let's just say, some other random stuff. 8, 7 of... we're just going to do ace X, jack of diamonds. So that gives us another 3 more. So that should get us to 18 total. I'm not thrilled about bluff raising ace X, jack of diamonds, but I did not find a better one. And as I said, I'm trying to do this quick. 12. Alright, so we got 18. So this is a reasonably balanced range here. We got 18 plus 12 plus 36 or 37. That gets us defending the right number. Our raising range is balanced with our bluff raising range. We found here that we weren't raising this last... I feel really good about all these bluff raises other than this ace X jack of diamonds, but I wasn't seeing anything better to raise. There are some other options. You could raise like 8, 7 of clubs or pocket 8s with a diamond, but we went with that. So now now we've got a pretty reasonable... What's going on here? We've got a pretty reasonable flop defending range here. So now we're going to go on to the turn. Now, it of course makes sense that most of our flatting range should be medium strength hands, or medium strength made hands, and medium strength draws. But one thing we want to be very careful about with our flatting range is to make sure we're not going to be in a lot of trouble on a lot of turn cards. So what I'm going to do right here is before I randomly generate the turn card, I want to look over all the turn cards at a glance and make sure there's not too many turn cards that we're going to be in a lot of trouble with. Alright, so let's look. So, first of all, any diamond can put a really strong hands in our range. So if the turn comes a diamond, we're totally fine. Any ace can make us hit the 3 ace queen we called with, or sorry, the 6 ace queen we called with. So we're going to be pretty okay if the turn comes an ace. If the ace is a diamond, likewise we have flushes. The king puts straights and 2 pairs in our range. That looks fine. The queen or the jack puts 2 pairs and sets into our range. The 10 puts 2 pairs and sets into our range. The 9 puts a bunch of trips into our range, and the 8 puts a few 2 pairs into our range as well. And straights, sorry. So the 8 puts straights and 2 pairs into our range. So just already looking at it, if the turn is any card that's higher than an 8 or a diamond, we're pretty much okay. We can have some very strong hands in our range. As we get lower, as we get to the non-diamond 7, 6, 5, 4, 3s, and 2s, then our range becomes capped at ace-queen here. Now, being capped at ace-queen isn't terrible. We still have top pair, top kicker, but it is something at least worth noticing. It is possible that if our opponent's really good, he can punish us for this. In practice, are you going to get punished for having your range capped at ace-queen? No. Not almost ever at small stakes, or at least 2-4 and lower. So, you're not really going to get punished for the most part if your range is capped at ace-queen, and even if he was a really good player that knew your range was capped at ace-queen, it's still hard for him to have ace-queen beat a very high frequency. Nevertheless, that is something important to notice. So, we're mostly going to be okay on most turn cards, have some very strong hands in our range, and even if the turn card does miss our range, we'll still have a pretty strong hand at the top of our range. But nevertheless, we want to focus on that and make sure we can have strong hands on the range, because in some board textures, if you're only flatting medium strength hands, you can be in a lot of trouble on a lot of turn cards. But here it looks like we're okay. Alright, so let's randomly generate that turn card. So I just randomly generated the card off screen, and it was the 5 of hearts. So we're going to have that slight problem that I just talked about. Our range is capped at ace queen. So since our range is capped at a, not terrible, but still not, relatively low, we're not going to be able to value raise this turn. We can't really represent any hands that are strong enough to get it in against our opponent on the river, where we're better off raising than calling. As I mentioned, when we raise the turn, our opponent's only going to need to felt around a third of his, flop betting and turn betting range. So if we imagine our opponent, I'm going to use my calculator right here. If we imagine our opponent bets, the top 70% of his range on the flop, which in practice is close to what most people do, and, the next 50% of his range on the turn, sometimes he'll check raise some very strong hands, but for the most part, he's betting, the 70% best hands in his range on the flop, and around the 50% best range of his hands in the turn. At least in practice, that's what people do the vast majority of the time. That gets us to 35%. So now our opponent has, the top 35% for the most part of his range on the, that he could have been dealt on the flop. So there are some exceptions. For example, our opponent might have check folded pocket 5s on the flop, but for the most part, he's got, the top 35% of hands he could have on the turn, with a few exceptions. So if we raise this turn, and we only make him felt around a third of that, 35 times 0.32, we're now up against pretty close to the 11% best hands our opponent can flop. Very, very close to that. So if you are using Flopzilla, and I would really recommend, I should have mentioned this earlier, but I would really recommend you go along and do this with me. So if you have the program, bring it out and do it along with me as we do the next few hands. You'll see if your opponent's felting the top 11% of his hands in his middle position range, you're not really going to be doing that awesome. So let's go ahead and look and see how well you're doing against a middle position open range if they're only felting around the top 11% of their range. Okay, well, we can see right here, he has an overpair beat around 12.2% of the time, and that's by 27 combos. So even if we take out, the 3 combos of pocket 5s, because he probably, he might not be able to have pocket 5s on the turn, he's still going to have, he's still going to really only have hands that are better than us by the time he felts the river. So when we raise our opponent on the turn here, we can't really expect him to felt worse than ace queen. He might not even felt ace queen, so it doesn't make sense for us to have a raising range here. And if we can't have a raising range here, we're just going to use the exact same thought process that we used on the flop when we always had to defend by calling. So we're just going to call the top 60% of the 36 or 37 hands we have here. So let's just go ahead and do that. So 36 times, or we'll put turn 5 of hearts, and then 36, or it was 37 times 60% equals 0.37 times 0.6 equals 22 hands. And so now we just need to find 22 hands we want to call with. Alright, so let's go ahead and throw in this 6 ace queen. That's easy. We're going to say that it's going to equal 22, so call, ace queen. That's 6. What else do we got? We got king queen suited. That's 3. Or king queen suited. Let's just put queen jack suited right with it. So that's 6 total for those. So we've already got 12. Then let's just say sure. We'll call with pocket jacks. That gives us another 6. And then we'll call with, how many flush draws did we have? Flush draws 4. Okay, so that would get us right to the 22. Technically, I would probably want to call with something like 3 pocket jacks and then 3 maybe like jack 10 suited. So that sounds even a little bit better. So that gets us to the 22 hands we want to call. Once again, it's a pretty nice range. We're going to have some problems on the river. We're not going to talk about the river in too much detail, but we still need to look ahead to the river when deciding how to defend our range on the turn. So on the river, our range is still going to be capped relatively low on a lot of, river cards where the turn or the river is a low non-diamond, but we'll still be able to balance the river with some bets of ace queen and some, missed draws. And when our opponent does check to us on the river, we can just check back jacks, check back queen jack, all that kind of stuff. And then, as I said, we can balance out a bet with, ace queen, a few missed draws, and maybe bet with king queen as well. So it looks like a pretty good range for giving the 5 of heart turn, and I think our range on the flop was pretty good as well. So overall, I would think we played this hand quite well if we use these ranges. Alright, so now it's going to be time to move on to flop number 2. And I have already randomly generated the flop and the turn, but there was a problem in the recording, so now I'm going to go over it again. And this is actually going to be a pretty difficult flop and turn to do. But, as I said, I've already done it, so I have a little bit of practice with it, and it's going to be a good one since it's a lot different than the first flop where we're going to have a lot of strong hands on the turn. Alright, so the flop I randomly generated was Ace 8-4 Rainbow. So the first thing we do is look at how many hand combos we have. We have 103. So Ace of Spades, 8 of Clubs, 4 of Diamonds. We have, I should have put it right down there. Ace of Spades, 8 of Clubs, 4 of Diamonds. Total combos is 103. Combos defended, 103 times 0.6 is going to get us 62. Alright, so now we have our first interesting decision in the hand. What do we want to value raise on this board? You can value raise nothing if you want. You can just call your entire range. That's something that's very reasonable to do here. You could raise hands, some of your hands that are strong enough to raise for value, and slow play others. And when you do decide which hands you want to raise, there's both a reasonable argument for raising Ace-King and flatting with the sets, and for raising the sets and flatting with the Ace-King. So any of those options is very reasonable. What I personally like to do more often than not, so I'm going to do it here, is in general, I like to raise hands that I know I can get value with now, and then slow play the hands that I know are going to be strong enough that I can raise them on the turn. This doesn't work perfectly here, but it's just a rule that I generally like to use, so I am going to use it right here because I do think it works okay. And I'm going to raise some, but not all, of my Ace-King. So I'm going to raise my 6 Ace-King, whereas I'm going to slow play pocket 8s and pocket 4s, because I know those hands are going to be strong enough that I can raise them on the turn. I'm also going to call with the other 3 Ace-King combos. Once again, if you wanted to raise with the sets here and flat with the Ace-King, that's a very reasonable argument as well, but I'm just going to raise 2/3 of my Ace-King and flat with everything else, because I want to mostly defend this flop by flatting, and then I can have some strong hands in my range on the turn. Okay, so we're going to value raise 6 combos of Ace-King, so we probably should bluff raise around 10 combos. So we'll get to that at the end, but if we're value raising 6 combos and bluff raising 10, 62 minus 16, that's going to get us 46. And so now we need to figure out what other hands we want to call with. We're calling with a relatively wide range here, which is how I prefer to do it. Alright, so let's see how many top pair hands we have. We have another 18 top pair. I'm going to go ahead and list them all. Ace-Queen, which is going to be 12. Ace-Jack suited, which is going to be 3. Ace-10 suited, which is going to be 3. Then we also can flat with pocket jacks, pocket 10s, 9-8 suited, and 8-7 suited. So that's going to give us 6 pair, 6-5 out pairs, and then 12 pairs that are between, top pair and middle pair. Alright, so let's count that now. Now we have 3 plus 6, that's 9, plus 12, that's 21, plus 3, that's 24, 27, 39, and that gets us to 45. So we're just one combo short of our desired calling range, but that's totally fine. We're not going to worry about one combo. And then we need a bluff raise to get us to 10. So the bluff raising is pretty easy. I would just prefer to use gut shots since we're going to know we're good when we turn, the nuts there. So that gets us to 8 combos. And then for the last 2, it doesn't really matter what you pick to bluff raise. You could bluff raise with 9s if you'd like. You can bluff raise with something, like 10-9 of clubs and 10-9 of diamonds, because those hands are very easy to double barrel. If you have 10-9 of diamonds, you can clearly double barrel any 7, any jack, or any diamond on the turn. So there's quite a few choices you have here. I'm just going to use 10-9 of clubs and 10-9 of diamonds. And we're going to just, this looks like a reasonable range to me. So, once again, we're going to go over all the turn cards we could possibly get. I think that was really useful when we did it in the first hand, but you can already kind of quickly see, if we have a king, that gives us some 2 pair, and we still have slow played sets. If we have an ace, we have a ton of trips, and we still have boats from pocket 8s and pocket 4s. Same deal, if the turn comes a queen, we have a billion, or 12, I guess technically 9. We have 9 top 2 pair hands, as well as a ton of sets, so a queen's an amazing card. Jack's a great card, and we still have tons of sets, so there's really not any turn cards that are going to not let us have some very, very strong hands in our range. Even if the turn comes a 2, for example, we're still going to have some sets. So, because our range is going to be so strong on the turn, we don't have that problem that we had in the previous hand, where if we get a low card that didn't complete any flush draws, our range was kind of capped relatively low. Here, no matter what the turn comes, we're still going to have quite a few sets. As I said, like even a jack or a 10 puts more sets in our range, it puts 2 pairs in our range, so we're going to have a very strong hand range on the turn no matter what the turn card is, so we don't have to worry about our opponent recklessly betting us on the turn or double barreling a very high frequency, with big bets. So now when I randomly generated the turn card, the turn was a 10 of spades, which caused a lot of problems that I'm going to talk about. Alright, so on the turn, we had 45 combos. The desired amount of combos we're going to defend is going to be 45 times 0.6, which is going to give us 27 combos. So now, what I wrote right here, since I really want to, I want to teach you how this works, we're not just trying to bang out the turn range as quickly as we can. Let's talk about what combos do we want to defend. As I mentioned, the Jack and the 10 put a lot of 2 pairs in our range, and on top of that, they give us more sets. So what hand combos do we want to defend on the turn? Well, first we have all the sets. 10s, 8s, 4s, that's 9 combos. And then we have ace 10 suited, that's another 3 combos. So that means 12 out of 27 combos, or 12 divided by 27, 44.4% of our turn range is top 2 pair or a set. That's pretty much insane. So we're already starting to see how incredibly strong our turn range is, which is going to make us ask a couple questions when our opponent bets into us. We're going to talk about that in a minute. I want to finish writing out all the combos I want to defend. We have 3 combos of ace-king, and then we have also 12 combos of ace-queen, and 3 combos of ace-jack suited. Trying to look to see if there's anything else we'd really want to defend with. We can just scroll up. That looks pretty reasonable to me. So we had these 12 combos plus another 3, which is 15, plus another 12, which is 27, plus another 3, which gave us 30. So we desire to defend 27, and then we have 12 right there, plus 3, 15, 30 already. So we already have 30 combos, which are like top paired, reasonable kicker or better. We have a ton of strong hands here. So now whenever you approach a problem like this, you kind of want to try to make it make sense to you. So I wrote down some questions that I'd be asking myself. Number 1 would be, is our pre-flop flatting range too strong? Maybe the reason why we're here in this turn spot with such an incredibly strong range is we're being too much of a nit pre-flop. Maybe we should be flatting super wide pre-flop with a ton more suited connectors, suited gappers, suited aces, hands like ace-jack off and king-queen off. So then when we get to the turn, we have much more of a balanced range and we're not just super, super strong. That's a possible theory. The problem with that theory is, and I'm not saying this is a perfect pre-flop flatting range by any means, so please don't misinterpret that. But the problem with that theory is, now when you design your pre-flop flatting range, you're not just looking at how strong you are in the on the turn against a double barrel on a board texture like this. You have to think, how should every single position respond to a middle position open? So if middle position opens, how should the cutoff respond? How should the button respond? How should the small blind respond? How should the big blind respond? How should the 3 betting ranges look? Because the problem with widening this range a lot is if you start flatting much wider than this in the cutoff and in the button, now you're kind of taking away middle position's incentive to open with the weakest hands that middle position opens with. Middle position shouldn't really be opening with hands like Queen 9 suited or, Ace 5 suited if you're going to 3-bet him a ton and you're going to flat him in position with a super, super wide range, because then now he's out of position with a hand like Ace 5 suited or Queen 9 suited too much, where it's not going to be profitable for him to open it, because your opponent does not like being out of position with those hands. So, even though that's something you would want to look into, is the pre-flop flatting range too strong, that's really something you'd have to look at separately from this and think, okay, if middle position opens, how do I think all the positions should respond in defending so that middle position has an incentive to still open some weak hands, yet he's also not printing money? I think this range that we're using is a pretty reasonable range. I've spent a lot of time with preflop, so whereas this isn't a perfect range, I still think it's a pretty good one, so I don't think this is mostly a preflop problem. Number 2, should our opponent ever be betting both the flop and the turn on the texture? Maybe he messed up by betting twice. This one I think is a lot more interesting. Hopefully by the time this video is out, my donking theory series is out, but even if it's not, that's fine. It'll probably come out soon after this. It's very interesting to think about how people don't have a problem continuation betting super wide. That's what they were taught to do. That's what poker books tell them to do. Yet, people would not donk very wide. People don't donk wide at all. So, for example, it seems very normal for our opponent to bet the flop and bet the turn here since he's the pre-flop raiser. Yet if our opponent cold called, it would seem very, very awkward for him to donk on an ace 8-4 board. And very, very weird for him to, after donking the flop, bet the turn on a 10 turn. That just doesn't seem normal to donk on a dry board. But yet that doesn't make sense why you should bet out of position on one board, Why does it make sense for you to bet out of position as the pre-flop raiser, but not out of position as the cold caller? It usually doesn't. That's kind of just a bad habit people have. So I think here, what's more close to being true is this is just a bad flop and a bad turn for our opponent's range compared to ours. He should know we have a ton of sets on the turn, we had more sets from the turn coming to 10, and we have more two pair now from the turn coming to 10, especially since the 10 gave us all top two pair combos, since the ace and the 10 are both spades. So this is probably a board texture where our opponent shouldn't be betting both the flop and the turn almost ever, or if he should be betting them, it should be with a very strong range and not at that high of a frequency. So that's something that I would really want to think about. And lastly, number 3, how would our range change if we raise sets on the flop but flatted with ace-king? Does this cause problems since now we can double barrel more effectively? Okay, so if we raised our sets on the flop, now we're not going to have this problem where we want to raise hands on the turn, but by the same token, when we raise the turn, we're also going to be defending too many hands. So on one hand, that's another solution we could have. Usually, as I said, I like to delay my raises when I can do it. So if I flop a full house, usually I'll delay my raises to a later street. But maybe in this case, since we're going to be so strong on the turn so often, maybe we want to raise the sets on the flop now, and then that way when the turn comes, we can just flat with all of our strong hands. We just flat with ace-king. Yeah, we'll still have pocket 10s or ace-10 suited that can raise, but we'll have more ace-kings that flat, whereas here, we also want to raise with pocket 8s and pocket 4s. So maybe that was the problem. Maybe we should have raised with our sets instead of ace-king, and that's the problem. Lastly, even if we do flat with our ace-kings on the flop and raise our sets, now we're going to have problems on other turn cards. Let's imagine the turn wasn't a 10 of spades, but was a 5 of spades. Now, we're not going to have any hands that can raise on the turn. We're going to have to flat with our entire range, so now our opponent's going to be able to double barrel very effectively. When we had the 10 on the turn, that wasn't a problem since we could raise ace-10 and pocket 10s, and we could put him in very tough spots when he, double barrels some of his turn flush draws, or if he double barreled some gut shots or opened into straight draws. But here, we're not really going to be able to raise the turn. So when we flat with ace-king, sometimes the turn's going to come a 5, and the river's going to come a 2 of spades, and then he run into the flush draw. Whereas when we flat with the sets, we can punish his double barrels by raising the turn. So if our opponent is double barreling a hand like, 6-5 suited on the turn or a spade draw on the turn, we can raise him and make him really hate his life because now he's getting raised on the turn with a draw that really wanted to see a river card and win a big pot. So basically what I'm getting at is this turn's a very complicated spot, and just to be completely honest with you, I don't know the answer. And I really try not to avoid tough spots when I make videos because I don't think it's super helpful if I just try to avoid, the tough spots and illustrate the easy examples. Part of getting better is really challenging yourself, trying to figure out a solution to problems and really thinking about it, even if you're going to be wrong and you're going to have to improve while you're thinking. So here, all this stuff is kind of going through my mind on the turn. I'm very much confused by this spot, but I'm still learning a lot. One of the things that I really learned here is now I really know when I'm in middle position and I bet the flop and got this turn, that is a terrible, terrible turn card to double barrel. I will still double barrel some really good hands to double barrel. I'd still probably double barrel a hand a spade draw or queen jack for the open-ended straight draw because I just don't think there's a better option. But now that I'm aware how hard it's going to be to even, to not defend too much as the flop caller on the turn, now I really know, okay, so when I am middle position and I'm thinking about double barreling here, I really don't want to do this with a gut shot. Against some players, maybe I won't even want to do it with an open-ended straight draw because it just hits his range so incredibly hard. So you can learn while you're still trying to figure out a solution to this problem. So now it's kind of like we have to pick what we think is the reason why we have such a strong range here and just kind of go with it. So my best guess is that our opponent's probably making a mistake by double barreling here. He should not be double barreling here almost ever. It hits our range too hard, and I'm confident that my pre-flop flatting range, maybe it's slightly too tight, but I'm still relatively confident that hands like ace-king belong in it. I'm still relatively confident that slow playing sets on the flop some of the time is going to be a very good thing when we have a 5 of spades on the turn and we can raise and make him fold his really good draws. So I'm just going to think my opponent probably made a mistake by betting here twice, and I'm going to talk about how we should defend it. Alright, so for value raising, I think I'm going to raise some but not all of my sets. I'm going to call with pocket 10s, because I want to let my opponent triple barrel here. I don't want to make him fold a hand like ace-queen, and I think people make a mistake of double barreling ace-queen on this turn card, even though it looks like he shouldn't be doing it. So let's go ahead and write it down. I'm going to call with pocket 10s. And once again, if you look at the combos we need to defend right here, we're not defending almost anything worse than ace-queen. So if you were in middle position here and you bet the flop and the turn with ace queen, like I'm guessing the vast majority of the video watchers do, they bet flop, turn, and river with ace queen, that seems like it's going to be way too thin and actually bad against a good player. That's not something that's going to be bad when you're just playing a random table at micro limits or probably even most SSNL opponents. Yet it looks like it's going to be bad against a really good player, so keep that in mind. You're learning, you're getting better. Alright, so anyways, let's see. I'm going to value raise. I'm going to go with pocket 8s. I'm going to go with pocket 4s. And I'm going to go with, and I'm actually even going to call with ace-10 suited. This seems like a very, very tight call, but I'm starting to think my opponent might not even need to felt a hand like ace-king, much less ace-queen, which I don't think he will felt. So I'm just going to call down with ace-10 suited because our range is so incredibly strong here. So we're value raising pocket 8s, we're value raising pocket 4s. That gets us 6 combos, and we want to bluff raise slightly less than a 1-to-1 ratio, so I'm going to say we're going to bluff raise 5 combos. So if we're value raising 6 and we're bluff raising 5, that's 11. If we wanted to defend 27, then we would only need to defend 16 here. But as I already talked about, that's not really going to be possible. We're going to defend quite wider in practice. So ace-king's going to give us 3 more combos. So we were up to 5 with very, very strong hands. Ace-king gives us 3 more. Ace-queen gives us 12 more. And ace-jack suited gives us the last 3. So that gets us to 3, 12, 18, plus 25, that's 23. So we're defending 6, 23, that's 29 plus 5. We're going to be defending 34 out of our 45 turn combos. So once again, we're defending 75% of the time here on the turn. That is too wide, but I think our opponent made a mistake by betting twice, so I'm going to go ahead and defend that wide. For bluff raising. Okay, so what do we have on the turn that can bluff raise? I guess we could bluff raise. It's kind of like we can take our pick. We could bluff raise pocket jacks. I'd rather just bluff raise the 9-8 and the 8-7 suited. Why not? So let's say 9-8 suited, since those have better outs, and then 8-7 suited. So something like this. So this is what the range I would defend on the turn. It looks very awkward, and we know something's wrong here. Okay, so the one last thing I wanted to mention before we move on to the next hand is theory is usually very, very good at telling you when something seems wrong or something seems a little bit off, but it's not usually very good at giving you the correct answer. So what exactly is the correct answer for how we should defend our range here? I don't know. But the fact that we are not folding very often at all to a turn bet here really makes me think someone's doing something wrong. Another really good way to illustrate that concept would be, imagine you open under the gun and someone flats in the small blind. If the flop comes 6-6-4 rainbow and your opponent donk bets from the small blind, that doesn't make almost any sense to me. I've definitely had people do that to me when I'm sitting in under the gun and I think, why on earth would you donk bet this here? My range has almost all the pocket aces, all the pocket kings, and almost all the pocket queens that either of us can have. Maybe small blind has most, if not all, of his pocket queens, but almost never has his pocket kings or pocket aces. And if the board's 6-6-4, when I open under the gun, I can still have like 6-5 suited, 6-7 suited, and pocket fours, whereas the small blind can't usually have any of those hands. So when he donk bets there, it doesn't make any sense to me. So it's very hard to say like what should be a theoretically correct response when my opponent donk bets to me in this spot, when it's hard to imagine that the small blind should be doing anything other than checking his entire range on the flop. If he did slow play a big hand, or if he did flop quads because he flats with pocket sixes, he's much better off check calling that hand and letting me double and triple barrel. So in a spot like that, it's very hard to think what should be a theoretically correct response. I would be thinking about this hand that way. I don't know for sure if it's that way. Maybe in a year or two, when I'm better at theory than I am now, I will know that. But right now, I'm starting to think, hey, maybe this is just a spot where he literally should not be betting the flop and the turn with any hands in his range, because this turn card just nails my range so hard. He's better off checking and letting me fire off bluffs and value bet too thin myself. He shouldn't be betting with his really, really strong hands. There's more value in him check calling them or check raising them, since it hits my range so much harder than his. Alright, so now let's randomly generate a third flop, and let's try to do this one a little bit quicker. I know that one took a long time. It was a very complicated spot. Alright, so we got King of Hearts, 8 of Clubs, 2 of Clubs. This one looks like it's going to be quite a lot easier. Total combos is going to be 110. And so the total combos we're going to want to defend is going to be 110 times 0.6, which is going to give us 66. Alright, so now we can just quickly go over what we want to value raise. I'm just raising all my ace-king here for 12. I'm going to raise my pocket 8s here for 3 more. I'm going to also raise some flush draws. Going to take a quick glance at that. Going to go for the 3-nut flush draws. Raising king, queen, and king, jack of clubs here I think is pretty bad. If you are doing that, you probably want to stop. and ace 10 club, an ace jack of clubs. If you don't see why raising that's bad, go ahead and ask me in the forums and I'll talk about it in a bit more detail. Okay, so we got 18 hands we're value raising with here. How many do we want to bluff raise? Well, 15 of these are made hands, so let's say that gets us to 25. Let's just say 26 or 27. We'll go for 26. And then 66 minus 18 minus 26. We're going to want to flat with around 22 hand combos. So this is a board where it looks like I'm mostly going to be defending by raising. Alright, so let's see what we're going to call with. We're going to call with 7 flush draws. Flush draws 7. King, queen suited. What else do we got? King, jack suited. So that's 6 right there. Alright, do we have any other kings? Nope. Let's move on to pocket jacks. That gives us 6 more. Then we can have 8, 9, 8 suited. 8, 7 suited. 3 more. And then if we add in pocket 10s, I imagine this is now we're defending too wide, but I think that's going to be fine here. So king jack suited, so that's going to give us 18, 21, 21 plus that, 24 plus 7, that's 31. So we have 31 hand combos here, which looks like we're defending a little bit too wide by calling. So because of that, one thing you could do, which I guess I would recommend doing here, would be, you can just flat with some ace king. So let's make this 6. Now we're going to flat with 6 more ace king. And when you're wondering what type of ace-king would make sense to defend by flatting here, you could flat with ace-king with the ace or the king of club, because then there's not going to be really any bad turn cards that you can call down very effectively, or even raise the turn if you got a perfect turn card. So, now this is going to be 12 hands instead on the flop, and then we're going to be bluff raising instead 9, maybe let's say 14. Alright, so let's say we're going to bluff raise 16 here. So we're going to redo that again. 66 minus 12 minus 16. So that's going to be 38. So now we're going to want to defend 38 hand combos here. Alright, so we've got 12, 18, 24, 27, 30, 37, so that looks right around perfect. Okay, so I did a quick correction. If you're wondering, well, hey, now that we're splitting the ace-king in half, and you mentioned to mostly flat with the club, in practice, look at your opponent's stats and figure out whether or not you want to raise with ace-king or whether or not you want to flat with it. You don't need to randomize your ace-king based on whether or not you have a club. Unless your opponent's really, really good, then it's a nice little trick to do. It's good to flat with the ace-king with the ace-clubs. Alright, so bluff raise. So let's just do, ace queen with the club, ace jack with the club, the usual trick where we raise, the backdoor nut flush draws, ace queen heart heart, ace jack heart heart. That gets us to 8. And then what else would we want to raise with here? Let's think. Well, we raised all the 2 pair. We could have flatted with pocket 9s and raised the 8, 7 or 8, 9. That's fine too. But let's just keep adding, backdoor flush draws. We have, queen, king of hearts, jack 10 of hearts, 10, 9 of hearts. Once again, a hand like jack 10 of hearts, remember that this hand's going to double barrel very, very effectively because any queen or 9 gives us an opening into straight draw, and any heart gives us, any heart gives us the flush draw, and even the pair's not bad. So, pretty effective hand to raise with here. So we're at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So we've already got 12 of the hands. We're just going to need 4 more. What else do we want for the last 4? We can just keep doing that. We could do, 7, 6 of hearts. 7, 6 of hearts. And then, do we have any offsuit queens? Not so much. Alright, so then for the last one, I'm going to put 8s, pocket 9s with a club. And we can put, pocket 8s with a club. Which gets us to, oh, we don't need all those. That alone's enough. Alright, so that gets us to the 16 hand combos we wanted. Okay, so just a quick thing to note, once again, we don't want to spend too much time on the flop. If I was doing this better, if I was a better player than I am right now, I probably would have flatted with these pocket 9s and bluff raised with this 9-8, because the 9-8 has better outs as a bluff raise, whereas pocket 9s can call and beat our opponent when he's betting an 8. So I messed up there. That should be switched. I definitely am not perfect at doing this. Alright, so let's go to the turn. I'm going to randomly generate it. And I got the 5 of clubs. Alright, so let's do it. We have 37 hand combos in our range. So our total turn range is 37 hand combos. And then we have desired defending range. That's going to be, let's see, 37 times 0.6. That's going to be 22. Okay, so then now we can talk about what hands we want to raise on the turn. So we have obviously a lot of, let's see how many flushes we can have actually. We had 7 flush draws on the flop. Does the 5 block any of them? I guess it blocks 1. So, where's the flush? So yeah, we raise the 3 ace high, so we have 6 flushes on the turn. Alright, so we have 6 flushes on the turn, and we don't need to raise them all, but we can definitely raise some of them. So let's say we want to raise, 3, we want to raise the 3 king high flush draws or something like that, or the 3 queen high flush draws. Let me look at them once more. I'd probably raise the queen jack of spades, or sorry, the queen jack of clubs, the jack 10 of clubs, and the 10-9 of clubs. And the reason for that is I don't want to let my opponent peel when he's double barreling a club himself, and I want to be able to have a raising range here. So the 10-9 of clubs and the jack 10 of clubs, you could debate calling with them because you don't want to get it in against the worst flush. But for the most part, if my opponent has me overflush, I'm going to stack off here. That's fine. So I would personally raise these 3. With more analysis, you might find you'd rather raise the kings and flat with these. But for the most part, I like to raise the vulnerable flushes that I think I can get it in with. And then we're going to raise those 3 hand combos. And then we're going to, so those are value raises. Then we're going to want to bluff raise another 3 combos, I'm sorry. And then we're going to want to call with 22 minus 6 or 16. Alright, so let's see what we can do. Alright, so what do we want to call with? Let's look at top pair type hands. Alright, well we have the 6 ace king, which we're going to want to call. So that gives us 6 right there. Then we have king queen suited, which is going to want to call. Then we have king jack suited, which is going to want to call. So that gives us a 16. Some of these kings, and then we had the 3 flush draws, or the 3 flushes that are still slow playing, the king high ones. So that gives us the 17 hand combos we need. So on the turn, and this, once again, this intuitively just makes a lot of sense. On the turn, since all the flushes got there, we now need top pair or a flush to continue calling with. That seems right, that feels right, so this looks good. And then we're going to need a bluff raise with a few hands. So here, it would be really nice if we had some hands that gave us a reasonable draw. So we're going to look up to what we called with. Hey, we have pocket jacks here with a club. That seems like a reasonable hand to bluff raise. So bluff raise pocket jacks with a club, which will give us the last 3 hands. Alright, so now let's go ahead and look over our whole turn range and see how we did. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to check our opponent's middle position open and see how often our flushes are actually beat on the turn. Because one thing I'm a little bit nervous about is I want to make sure when I'm raising this 10-9 of clubs that I'm not going to be overflushed too often. So you can see without the dead cards, it looks like our opponent's going to have us beat 10% of the time, and that makes it seem really thin. But once we put in the clubs, that gets lowered to 5.4% of the time. So now I still like raising the low flushes because I think they're strong enough to get value from. I think most people double barrel here enough that it's an okay and good hand to value raise. Yet, I also don't want to let my opponent see a free card. And lastly, I want to make sure I stack my opponent when he does have a hand that I beat. So I want to make him have a really tough spot, have a tough decision to make when he has a set. I want to make him hate his life if he double barreled a hand like ace king with a club. He might check call it, but he might bet it. So I do like raising these weak flushes, and I think they are strong enough to raise with. So let's look at our flatting range. Now I'm noticing that this isn't 17, this is 15. That's what happens when I go quickly. Okay, so this range looks really good right here. If the river card comes up blank, we slow played 3 really good flushes, so we're just going to snap call. Hopefully our opponent will make a really big bet, or we'll go all in if he makes a small bet, and hopefully he'll call. And then since we flatted on the flop with hands like ace king with the club, that makes it a lot easier when the turn card comes a club. Because now, if the river card comes a club, if the river card comes something like a 10 of clubs, we're still going to have ace king with the ace of clubs sometimes. So that's one of the really, really nice things about when we flattered with ace king with the club, that when the turn card does come a club, we're going to be okay on a lot of rivers. If we look back to our value raising range, on the flop, we were raising some nut flushes, or some nut flush draws. So when we have a raising range that raises a lot of nut flush draws, our raising range is also okay on the turn when the turn card comes a 5 of clubs, because then we'll just have, ace queen of clubs, ace 10 of clubs, ace jack of clubs that already got there. So all these ranges are looking really well balanced so far. Okay, and then if the river card comes a blank, we still have some ace king that can call. We can muck our king queen and king jack suited. Then we obviously have some flushes that can jam and balance out with some bluffs. And then our bluff raising range is Jack of Clubs, Jack X. This isn't like an awesome hand to bluff raise on the turn. It's a reasonable hand, and we don't have better options. Sometimes we're going to bluff raise with the pocket jacks. The river will come a club. We'll check back. Our opponent will have a set, or he'll have a top pair. Sometimes we'll bluff raise with it, and the river will come a complete blank, and we'll fire out the last barrel, hoping to make our opponent fold a hand like, pocket aces with the ace of club or ace king with the club. So I think the pocket jacks are a decent hand to bluff. We might rather prefer to have like the ace of clubs to bluff with, but we can't have that, and there's nothing we can do about it, so it seems like a pretty reasonable hand to use. So now we're at the end of the video, and first of all, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a lot from it, and I hope what you learned you think will be very relevant and very useful for improving your own game. And I also had a couple of questions regarding the difficulty of this video. I wanted to mention I have avoided a turn theory series for a reason, and that's largely because the turn is very complex and difficult to approach. A lot of that probably came through pretty clearly in this video, where especially the second hand, that was a very, very difficult spot to play on the turn, especially if we were trying to hit certain ratios and defending frequencies. So I wanted to know, do you prefer me to pick easy examples or stick to random ones? Easier ones will illustrate concepts more clearly. So, I found the second hand the most interesting one because I've already done this a lot. I don't know if that's not that useful when you're seeing this stuff for the first time, if you'd really just rather me stick with overall more easy examples. I'm not just going to pick the easiest possible flop and turn texture, but if I do hand pick them rather than pick random ones, I can pick flops and turns where our entire range, turns out a lot more clear, and it's less ambiguous what lines we should take with what hands. The advantage of harder ones is harder ones will illustrate how to approach difficult concepts and begin understanding them. If I just pick easier flops, it will be a lot more clear for the most part, but you're not really going to see, me genuinely trying to figure out what to do, like you're probably going to have to do when you first start generating flops or turns if you've never done this before. Even if you get a very easy flop or turn, you're still probably going to be a little bit confused and have to backtrack. One of the advantages of me doing harder ones is I'll have to do that too, and you can see how I approach it. You can see how I try to figure out what's wrong when I notice I want to defend too much of my range. Lastly, harder ones, they also illustrate how it actually looks when you get randomly dealt flops, whereas if you just kind of try to pick out the easier ones or the more simple ones, I'm not really, for the players that are already a little bit more advanced, I'm not really showing them how to do more difficult ones, which are going to take more work to do. And the reason why I'm asking all this is because future concepts are even more difficult, such as how to balance betting and checking ranges out of position. It's much harder to play the turn out of position and decide whether or not to bet or check, or how to defend against a bet once your opponent bets, than it is to simply face a bet on the turn in position, where you know for the most part about how much you need to try to at least defend. So, when I go over more difficult concepts, which I imagine I eventually will, it'd be good if you let me know on this video if you already found this video too hard, because then I can know if I do a Flopzilla video for betting the flop out of position or checking the flop out of position or how to play the turn out of position, I can know you'd prefer me to pick easier examples rather than just do them randomly. Whenever I do a theory series, for the most part, I always start out with easier examples, but for here, I'd like to know whether or not you still prefer the easier ones or if you prefer more random ones. So, thanks everyone and good luck. Be sure to post any questions you have in the forums, and I'd really appreciate some feedback on this. So thanks. Bye.